Sarah Collins, a respected federal prosecutor, was on her way to municipal court to resolve something simple, a parking ticket. But what seemed like just another routine task quickly turned into an unexpected confrontation with injustice. In the center of a tension-filled courtroom, Sarah would face not only a rigid judge, but decades of prejudice ingrained in the judicial system. What happened next not only shook the structures of that courtroom, but also started a revolution that no one could have predicted. Stay until the end to find out how a single voice can challenge and transform an entire system. The sun had barely risen over the Atlanta skyline, but Sarah Collins was already on her feet, facing the chaos of a morning that promised to be anything but peaceful. Life sometimes surprises us with unexpected challenges, and that day, Sarah felt it. Between disputing a parking ticket and the urgency of a federal case involving human trafficking, she found herself torn between the personal and the professional. As she reviewed the Thompson case documents in a makeshift cafe on the way to the municipal courthouse, a question loomed in her mind: how to balance such diverse responsibilities without losing control. Perhaps the lesson here is that life rarely gives us time to breathe when we need it most. In the slow-moving traffic of the city center, Sarah stood her ground, listening to the news on the radio while mentally organizing her defense against the fine. She knew that the contradictory parking signs were her best chance of winning the case. But when her boss called with an emergency in the Thompson case, she realized that the day would take an even more complicated turn. How many times have we not found ourselves in situations like this, when it seems that everything demands our attention at the same time? Sarah took a deep breath and did what many of us do. She prioritized what was most urgent without letting go of her determination. When she arrived at the municipal court late, something inside her seemed to sense that the day would be different. In the rush to balance her responsibilities as a federal prosecutor and an ordinary citizen, Sarah didn't know that she was about to face a test not only of patience, but also of principles. Life has a funny way of putting us exactly where we need to be to learn or teach something important. And in that courtroom, Sarah was about to discover how small moments can turn into big changes. After all, who would have thought that a simple parking ticket would open the door to something much bigger? As she entered the municipal court, Sarah Collins felt the weight of the atmosphere. It was a place of strict rules, where every move seemed to be watched with critical eyes. Judge Barrett, known for his inflexible stance, was in charge. Sarah arrived late, something that went against all her principles. However, she knew that her morning had been dedicated to something more important, the Thompson case. But the judge didn't seem interested in hearing explanations. He interrupted the case in progress to publicly reprimand her, making it clear that punctuality was more valuable to him than justice. How many times in life do we come across people who confuse authority with respect? As Sarah stood firm at the podium, Judge Barrett announced a $500 fine for contempt, one of the highest ever recorded in that court for a delay. His tone was cold and calculated, as if he wanted to prove something to those present. Curiously, minutes earlier, a white man had arrived late and received only an indifferent look. The inequality was glaring, but Sarah kept her composure. She knew it wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. Sometimes the most uncomfortable situations force us to see the flaws in systems we thought were immutable. Murmurs began to fill the courtroom as the other defendants watched the scene intently. Some looked uncomfortable. Others were clearly outraged. Sarah realized that this moment wasn't just about a parking ticket or a delay. It was about how people were treated based on assumptions and prejudices. Judge Barrett, without realizing it, had created an opportunity for Sarah to expose something much deeper than he had imagined. And so, as he prepared to move on to the next case, Sarah knew it wasn't over yet. Something was about to change. Sarah Collins kept her composure as Judge Barrett announced the $500 fine for contempt. The courtroom, once just a space of bureaucracy and rules, now looked like a stage where ancient prejudices played out in front of everyone. But Sarah was no passive spectator. With a deliberate movement, she opened her briefcase and displayed her federal credentials, the gold seal glinting in the sunlight coming through the high windows. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. At that moment, Sarah was not just a defendant. She was a federal prosecutor exposing the flaws in a system she had sworn to protect. How many times in life are we called to take a stand, even when the price seems high? The impact was immediate. Judge Barrett, who moments before had seemed unshakable in his authority, was visibly disconcerted. He stammered as he tried to justify his stance, but Sarah wasn't there to listen to excuses. She pointed out, with surgical precision, the patterns of racial discrimination she had observed that morning, something so obvious that even the other defendants in the room began to murmur in agreement. It was as if a curtain had been lifted, revealing what many already knew, but few dared to say out loud. Sarah's courage was contagious. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a public lesson in equality and justice. As the judge tried to regain control of the situation, Sarah stood firm. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her or the fine. It was about something much bigger, the need to hold those in power to account and ensure that justice is truly blind. As she left the courthouse that day, she knew she had planted a seed of change in a system that had long been in need of reform. And so, as the sun shone brighter through the courtroom windows, Sarah made it clear that this story was far from over. The courtroom was absolutely silent, as if the very air had stopped to listen to what was coming next. Sarah Collins, with her firm posture and authoritative voice, turned the podium into a pulpit of justice. She didn't need to shout or show anger. Her words were sharp as a blade, cutting straight through the layers of prejudice that permeated the space. By exposing the discriminatory patterns in Judge Barrett's decisions, she not only defended herself, but gave a voice to everyone who had already been silenced by flawed systems. It was one of those rare moments when the power of truth seemed greater than any judge's gavel. Judge Barrett's eyes were fixed on Sarah, but his expression had changed. The man who had once exuded authority now seemed small in the face of her courage. He tried to regain control, suggesting that they discuss the matter in private, but Sarah refused. "Justice can't be done on the sly," she said, with a serenity that echoed through the courtroom. The room was full of attentive stares, some incredulous, others full of admiration. It was as if everyone knew they were witnessing something historic. Those words were not just for the judge. They were for everyone present and for a system that urgently needed to be confronted. Sarah's every word was a lesson in how courage can turn ordinary moments into extraordinary events. As she presented data and reports on racial disparities in court decisions, even the most skeptical in the room began to see the truth. The municipal court, which had once seemed like a place of inflexible rules and unquestionable authority, was now the scene of a silent revolution. Sarah wasn't just facing Judge Barrett. She was facing an entire system. And in that moment, it became clear that she was not alone. Every person in the room felt the impact of her courage and began to wonder, could they also do something to change the world around them? The courtroom seemed to have been left behind, but the impact of what had happened there was beginning to reverberate throughout Atlanta. Sarah Collins returned to her federal office, but her mind was still on the confrontation with Judge Barrett. As she reviewed the documents in the Thompson case, her phone began to vibrate incessantly. Messages from fellow lawyers arrived one after the other, sharing similar stories of discrimination they had faced in the same judge's courtroom. Many confessed that they had never had the courage to talk about it, fearing reprisals in their careers. Sarah realized that what she had faced was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much bigger. How many times do we let injustices pass us by for fear of taking a stand? Meanwhile, on social media, Sarah's story began to gain traction. A law student who was present in court published a detailed account of what happened, turning the case into a public debate about prejudice in the justice system. Hashtags such as #JusticeBlind and #Judicial Reform began to go viral, bringing to light other stories of inequality faced by ordinary citizens. It was as if a dam had been broken, releasing years of accumulated frustrations. Sarah's courage had lit a fire in people who had previously felt powerless in the face of a system that was as rigid as it was unjust. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the messages and calls that kept coming in, she received an unexpected call. It was Sharon Martinez, a renowned civil rights lawyer. "What you did today was historic," Sharon said enthusiastically. "We need to take this forward." Sarah knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she was no longer alone. The municipal court had become the epicenter of a much larger discussion about justice and equality, and Sarah was ready to face the next chapter in that battle. When the investigation into Judge Barrett's behavior was officially opened, it felt like a curtain was being lifted, revealing years of questionable practices hidden under the cloak of judicial authority. A team of investigators began analyzing the records of his decisions, and alarming patterns soon emerged. Higher fines, harsher sentences, and less time for defense were consistently applied to Black defendants and other minorities. It was as if the court had become a reflection of the inequalities that permeated society, but now with numbers and testimonies to prove it. How often do we ignore obvious signs of injustice because they seem part of normal? Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk who had worked alongside the judge for more than a decade, finally found the courage to share her own personal records. She had kept a discreet notebook where she jotted down incidents that seemed out of the ordinary, comments made by the judge, differences in the treatment of defendants, and even the tone used in their interactions. "I knew something was wrong," she told investigators, her hands shaking slightly as she flipped through her notes. It was as if each page was a silent cry for justice that was finally being heard. Sometimes it's the simplest actions, like jotting down a detail, that plant the seeds for big changes. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her work as a federal prosecutor, but her desk was now full of messages from lawyers and citizens sharing similar stories about experiences in local courts. It was as if her case had given permission for others to speak. "This isn't just about one judge," she told a colleague. "It's about an entire system that needs to be reformed." The investigation didn't just expose Barrett's prejudices. It also began to reveal much larger systemic problems. The municipal court had become the epicenter of a battle for equality, and Sarah knew it was only the beginning. The investigation into Judge Barrett quickly became the center of attention, but what began as an isolated case soon turned out to be a much deeper problem. As investigators analyzed the records of his decisions, alarming data began to emerge. Fines imposed on Black defendants were, on average, 3 times higher than those imposed on white defendants for similar offenses. Public pressure grew as these figures were released, sparking outrage on social media and in the news. It was impossible to ignore. Not only was the system failing to be fair, but it was also perpetuating historical inequalities. How often do we accept these injustices as part of the system without questioning them? Stories began to emerge from all sides. Lawyers, former defendants, and even court employees shared their experiences with Barrett's discriminatory behavior. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, revealed that for years she had kept a notebook of incidents she considered suspicious. "I knew this wasn't right," she said, as she handed over her notes to the investigators. It was as if a dam had been broken, releasing years of silence and fear. Sarah Collins' courage had inspired others to speak out, showing that real change begins when someone dares to challenge the status quo. Meanwhile, the media amplified the debate about racial inequality in the justice system. TV programs and opinion pieces discussed not only Judge Barrett's case, but also how it reflected a systemic problem present in courts across the country. Sarah Collins, now a central figure in the discussion, was invited to interviews and public events. But she knew that her fight went beyond media exposure. It was about creating concrete and lasting change. And so, as public pressure grew and more revelations came to light, it became clear that the Barrett case was just the tip of the iceberg. Under the relentless pressure of the investigation and public opinion, Judge Barrett began to feel the weight of his actions. The man who once commanded the court with unquestionable authority now found himself confronted by evidence he could not ignore. The detailed analysis of his decisions revealed a clear pattern of discrimination, and the testimonies of officials like Mrs. Thompson and James Wilson only reinforced the accusations. Barrett tried to justify his actions, claiming that he had never realized his own bias. But like many in positions of power, he had mistaken his limited perspective for impartiality. How often do we blind ourselves to our own mistakes until they are exposed to the light? As the investigation progressed, Judge Barrett was called to give formal evidence. Each session seemed to further dismantle his authority. When confronted with the cold data, higher fines for black defendants, harsher sentences, and a noticeably different tone in his interactions, he was unable to offer convincing answers. "I always thought I was being fair," he said in a more humble tone than usual. But fairness isn't just a question of intention. It's a question of impact. And the impact of his decisions had damaged real lives, creating barriers for those already facing systemic challenges. Finally, faced with the threat of a public trial and the complete loss of his reputation, Barrett made the decision to step down. It was a defining moment, not just for him, but for the entire local justice system. His departure symbolized more than the fall of a man. It was a warning to other judges and authorities about the consequences of perpetuating prejudices, even if unconsciously. As he signed his resignation letter, Barrett seemed smaller than ever, as if he had finally realized the weight of the lives affected by his decisions. But for Sarah Collins and everyone else involved in the fight for equal justice, that was just the beginning of a much bigger transformation. 3 months after the confrontation at the county courthouse, changes began to take shape. The courthouse building, which once symbolized bureaucracy and inequality, now displayed a new sign at the entrance: Center for Judicial Education and Equality. It was a reminder that justice is not just a matter of laws, but of how we treat every person who crosses those doors. New policies were implemented, including regular audits of court decisions to monitor racial disparities and mandatory bias trainings for all court employees. Sarah Collins, once just a federal prosecutor facing a parking ticket, was now leading the effort for real change. Sometimes the impact of our actions goes far beyond what we imagine at the time. Among the most significant reforms was the creation of an independent committee made up of community members, legal experts, and civil rights defenders. They reviewed the records of fines and sentences on a monthly basis, ensuring greater transparency and accountability in the courts. Mrs. Thompson, the former clerk of the municipal court, was promoted to lead a judicial monitoring program. "I finally feel like my work is contributing to something bigger," she said during an interview. It was as if each person involved had found a renewed purpose in transforming the system. After all, how can we expect true justice if we're not willing to examine our own failings? Meanwhile, Sarah began teaching weekly classes on ethics and prejudice in the legal system to law students. In her classroom, a picture with the receipt for the $500 fine was framed on the wall, not as a reminder of punishment, but as a symbol of resistance and change. "That receipt represents more than me," she explained to a group of young lawyers in training. "It represents all the people who have ever faced silent injustices and had no voice to fight back." The reforms didn't just transform the municipal court. They inspired other cities to adopt similar measures, proving that even the most rigid systems can be reimagined. The impact of Sarah Collins' case went beyond Atlanta's borders, spreading like a call to action across the country. Cities large and small have begun to implement reforms inspired by the changes that emerged after the municipal court confrontation. In New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, local courts have adopted regular audits to monitor racial disparities in fines and sentences. Bias training programs became mandatory for judges and court employees, while community committees were formed to ensure greater transparency. It was as if a spark had lit a fire that no one else could put out. How often do we underestimate the power of a single voice to initiate such a broad transformation? Sarah, now a central figure in this movement, began traveling around the country to speak at conferences and universities. At each event, she shared her experience, but also heard stories from others who had faced similar injustices. Young lawyers came to her with questions and ideas, while ordinary citizens shared moving accounts of their silent battles against unjust systems. "It's not just about a judge or a court," Sarah would say in her talks. "It's about how we ensure that justice is equal for everyone, everywhere." Her words resonated deeply, inspiring those who had previously felt powerless to believe that real change was possible. Meanwhile, national organizations began mobilizing to support local reforms. The American Bar Association launched a national program to review judicial practices, while civil rights NGOs created online platforms to document cases of discrimination in the courts. Sarah was invited to lead a federal commission dedicated to judicial reform, something she accepted with humility and determination. But even in the midst of growing recognition, she never lost sight of the larger purpose: to ensure that no one else had to face the kind of prejudice she exposed that day in the county courthouse. And so, as the movement gained momentum, Sarah knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew they were on the right track. The municipal court, once a symbol of bureaucracy and inequality, now breathed an air of renewal. The changes were not just structural, but deeply rooted in the way justice was administered. New monitoring programs led by community members ensured that every judicial decision was reviewed with transparency. Sarah Collins, who had started this revolution with her courage, was now seeing the fruits of her labor. The walls of the courthouse displayed posters with messages of inclusion and equality, while employees attended regular training sessions on prejudice. It was a constant reminder that justice is not just an ideal, but a daily practice that requires vigilance and commitment. Defendants entering the courthouse now found a more welcoming environment. A newly installed help desk offered free legal assistance, while signs in several languages ensured that everyone could understand their rights. Mrs. Thompson, the former court clerk, now led the court audit program. "It's amazing to see how small changes can make such a big difference," she said during a community meeting. James Wilson, the bailiff, also played a vital role, training new employees to recognize and combat prejudice in the workplace. It was as if each person involved had found a higher purpose to transform the system into something that truly served everyone. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her work as a federal prosecutor, but devoted part of her time to teaching ethics and justice at local law schools. In her living room, the receipt for the $500 fine was framed on the wall, next to photos with students and activists she inspired along the way. "This isn't just about me," she often said in lectures. "It's about all of us, about how every action we take can create ripples that change the world." The municipal court was no longer just a place where cases were settled. It had become a living symbol of transformation, and hope for the entire community. 3 months after the incident at the county courthouse, Sarah Collins has become a living symbol of transformation. Her courage in confronting discrimination not only exposed deep flaws in the justice system, but also inspired changes that many believed impossible. In the center of the renovated courthouse, a new plaque has been installed that reads, "Justice is not just about laws. It's about how we treat every person who walks through these doors." Below the inscription, the date of the confrontation with Judge Barrett marked the beginning of a new era. It was a reminder that even the simplest acts like contesting a fine can trigger waves of change. Sarah was now nationally recognized for her impact. At a special ceremony, she received an award for her contribution to equal justice. But for her, the real prize was seeing the reforms take shape. Courts across the country were adopting regular audits, mandatory bias training, and community-led programs to monitor judicial decisions. Mrs. Thompson, now head of a judicial oversight program, became emotional as she spoke at the ceremony. "For years, I saw inequities and felt powerless. Today, I know that every record I made helped build something greater. It was a moment of validation for all those who had struggled in silence." Meanwhile, Sarah continued her mission to educate and inspire. In her lectures at law schools and legal conferences, she always made a point of emphasizing that real change starts with small acts of courage. "The system only changes when the people within it refuse to accept the unacceptable," she would say firmly. With every class and event, she planted seeds in young lawyers and activists who would carry her message forward. Sarah's legacy was not just about the reforms implemented. It was about the renewed hope that justice could be transformed into something truly equal for all. Sarah Collins' story teaches us that extraordinary changes can begin in seemingly ordinary moments. Who would have thought that a simple parking ticket would become the catalyst for reforming an entire judicial system? Sarah didn't just stand up to a judge. She challenged a system steeped in inequality, showing that true justice requires courage, persistence, and, above all, humanity. Her journey reminds us that each one of us has the power to question the status quo and demand something better, even when it seems that we are alone. But this story also raises important questions. How often do we see injustices and choose not to act? How many times do we accept the system as it is, without realizing that we are part of it? Sarah showed us that change begins with a decision, the decision not to remain silent in the face of what is wrong. What if each person took this lesson forward? What else could we transform in our communities, in our workplaces, in our lives? Now I want to know, what would you do in Sarah's place? Would you have the courage to stand up to the system? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this content with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to keep learning how to turn challenges into opportunities. After all, change starts with you.